Welcome to A Smarter Way to Retire, where we break down complex financial topics to help you plan for a confident financial future. Today we're talking about tariffs, how they've shaped global trade historically, the unfair or uneven tariffs placed on U.S. goods, and what that means for our trade deficit. And this is a timely discussion given the recent policy proposals that could be reshaping global trade dynamics and are having an impact on our stock market as we speak, causing a lot of concern and in some cases panic among some of my clients. Because we're feeling uncomfortable right now about tariffs and trade wars, I thought this would be a great time to look back at the history of tariffs, trade deficits, and try to bring some perspective to the current situation we're faced with. So a brief history of tariffs. Tariffs have existed for centuries in most countries around the world, and they've been used as a tool for raising government revenue and protecting domestic industries. In early U.S. history, tariffs were a primary source of government income before we had income taxes. In the 1800s, the first significant tariff in the U.S. was the Tariff Act of 1789. Which provided for revenue for our young government and also to protect American manufacturers. Throughout the 19th century, tariffs were a primary source of government income before the introduction of income tax, first in 1861 to fund the Civil War, but then the U.S. income tax was officially born in 1913. And at that time, less than 1% of Americans had to pay the tax in those early days. High tariffs such as the Tariff Act of 1828, also called the Tariff of Abominations, led to sectional tensions between industrial North and agrarian South, which relied on cheaper imported goods. Perhaps the most infamous tariff in U.S. history, the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Act of 1930, raised tariffs on over 20,000 imported goods in an attempt to protect American businesses during the Great Depression. Instead, it actually worsened the global economic downturn as other nations retaliated with tariffs of their own, reducing international trade. Following World War II, the U.S. took a different approach. Through agreements like GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the U.S. promoted lower tariffs to facilitate global economic recovery. However, these reductions were often uneven. Many developing countries were given preferential trade terms, allowing them to impose higher tariffs on U.S. goods, while benefiting from low tariffs when exporting to the U.S. That was a strategic effort to help rebuild war-torn economies and spread wealth worldwide, supporting industrialization in Europe and Asia. The creation of the World Trade Organization in 1995 further reduced tariffs globally. Disparities still exist, often at the expense of U.S. manufacturers. The idea of helping to spread U.S. wealth around the world in an effort to rebuild after World War II was fantastic and worked wonders around the world, literally building economies out of the rubble that was left after the war. The problem is that this policy, where U.S. wealth gets spread around the world to rebuild after the war, this policy still exists. It's still in place 80 years later. Despite global tariff reductions, many countries still impose significantly higher tariffs on U.S. goods than the U.S. imposes on theirs. And here are some examples of unfair or uneven tariffs that hurt American businesses. Before the recent trade tensions, China had tariffs of 25% on U.S. autos, while the U.S. charged only 2.5% on Chinese autos. India imposed a 100% tariff on some U.S. agricultural products, including dairy and wine. The European Union leveled a 10% tariff on American cars, while U.S. tariffs on European cars were just 2.5%. Japan has historically imposed high non-tariff barriers like regulatory red tape, which made it difficult for U.S. automakers to compete. So the U.S. has long been at a disadvantage, allowing imports with low or no tariffs while facing steep duties when exporting abroad. These unfair trade practices have contributed to the U.S. trade deficit, meaning we import far more than we export. In 2023, the total U.S. trade deficit was over $1 trillion. That's $1 trillion leaving the United States in just 1 year. Let's break this down by country. China, the U.S., had a $280 billion trade deficit, largely due to higher Chinese tariffs and subsidies that make their goods cheaper. The European Union had a $200 billion trade deficit with the U.S. Mexico, $140 billion, primarily fueled by manufacturing moving across the border, and India, about a $40 billion trade deficit, exacerbated by high tariffs on U.S. goods. So what does this mean? One of the unintended consequences of persistent trade deficits is the growing wealth gap in America. When the U.S. imports more than it exports, manufacturing jobs tend to decline domestically to move offshore, and entire industries can shrink or move offshore. This has been particularly evident in sectors like steel, textiles, and consumer electronics, where American jobs have been displaced in favor of lower-cost labor overseas. At the same time, while middle-class manufacturing jobs disappear, corporate profits often rise as companies benefit from cheaper labor and materials abroad. These rising profits are reflected in the stock market, rewarding shareholders and executives with increased wealth. However, stock ownership in the U.S. is highly concentrated. According to the Federal Reserve, the top 10% of earners own around 90% of all stock market wealth. This means that while free trade and globalization have driven down costs for consumer goods, which is generally good for U.S. consumers, we love lots of cheap stuff. They also have disproportionately benefited higher income individuals who are invested in the stock market. Meanwhile, the working class, who historically relied on manufacturing and industrial jobs, have faced stagnating wages and reduced economic opportunities. Therefore, the wealth gap. In essence, the U.S. trade deficit doesn't just impact economic output, it also accelerates income inequality. Wealth generated from globalization and offshoring is concentrated at the top, while the middle and lower classes bear the brunt of job losses and wage pressures. So tariffs have played a major role in shaping global trade, but unfair or uneven practices continue to disadvantage American businesses and American workers. With policies like the proposed Liberation Day tariffs, the U.S. may look to correct these imbalances, but there are risks. There are certainly risks to consider. I think most Americans would agree that we need to rebuild our domestic manufacturing base, and I think we would also agree that we have to close the wealth gap. The question becomes, are tariffs the right approach? Or should they even be part of the approach? Great question. Still to be determined. But if we accept that tariffs could be a useful tool, then we have to ask, is the new policy too aggressive? Is it too fast? Is it too harsh? And ultimately, we have to consider, if not tariffs, what are the alternatives? If we don't use tariffs, what other tools do we have to level the playing field and close the wealth gap? How do we ensure that American workers aren't at a disadvantage in the global economy? And here's the biggest question of all. Are you willing to endure some short-term pain, higher prices, supply chain disruptions, potential economic turbulence, in order to potentially bring long-term relief to the middle and lower classes? to restore American manufacturing, to close the wealth gap? These are real questions facing us today. Tariffs aren't just about economics, they're about the future of America's workforce and whether we're willing to make tough decisions now for potentially a better future later. Potentially. If we agree that something needs to change, then the real debate is over how we do it. Do tariffs force foreign competitors to play fair, or do they spark economic retaliation that could hurt American businesses and consumers? I think the jury is still out on this one. Would a different approach like tax incentives for domestic manufacturers or investment in technology be more effective? What do you think? I'd love to hear from you. Shoot me an email with your thoughts or grab some time on my calendar for a discussion. This is also a great time to revisit your plan, to recalculate your probability of success, which I've done several times this week for clients. And in most cases, the results have been very reassuring. Use your model. That's what it's there for. And always remember, don't panic. We've been through this before. Although history doesn't repeat itself, it does rhyme. Thanks for listening to A Smarter Way to Retire, and don't forget to subscribe and check out Leonardi Family Wealth Care for full disclosures and additional resources. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.
Securities and investment advisory services offered through Mosaic Wealth, Inc., member FINRA SIPC. Mosaic Wealth is separately owned, and other entities and/or marketing names, products, or services referenced here are independent of Mosaic Wealth. The opinions expressed herein are for general information only and is not necessarily the opinions of Mosaic Wealth or its representatives. Investing is subject to risk, including loss of principal invested. Past performance is not a guarantee of future results. No strategy can assure a profit nor protect against loss. It is not intended to provide specific advice or recommendations for any individual. Please consult your financial professional, attorney, or tax advisor with regard to your individual situation.